Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to this first edition of my content series while I'm stuck at home during the Corona time. And what I thought of doing uh, is basically a little bit of a Decktech series because I have a lot of cool decks that I would like to share with the public. Um, uh, I will see, of course, how much time I have, but I want to get to one at least for every week that this quarantine is going on. And so the first thing I wanted to do was my uh, Mono Black Suicide list, which is probably the deck I'm most famous for, in quotation marks, I'd say, which I play most often. But I wanted to do it a little bit differently than the usual deck tech because this is a deck I've played for the better part of like 7 years, and of course there was a lot of evolution in that deck and a lot of lessons I learned along the way, basically, and I want to extrapolate on those lessons beforehand and showing off some of the older iterations of the deck that I can still think of. So the first one, this is from a deck list from 2013. As you can see, it has a lot of cards that aren't seeing much play anymore, some that aren't legal anymore in the format. And yeah, this was the first iteration of the deck. I was pretty new to the format still. I was working with a tight budget, so a lot of staples are still not in here. Um, but the idea for the deck basically came as uh, I wanted to play an aggressive black deck, but a lot of the decks I saw online, a lot of the traditional mono black suicide lists, were playing a lot of cards that were a little bit too risky for my taste, I'd say. That were efficient mana wise, but came with massive downsides. You know, some classic stuff like Phyrexian Negator, for example. Yeah, you get a 5/5 trample for 3 mana, but you also have to sacrifice a bunch of permanents when it gets damaged. Um, and so I didn't want to play that. I wanted to play kind of a more safe route, kind of like an aggro control shell that could come out of the gate very quickly, but also had some late game staying power. And that's basically um, what I tried to do with this list. The problem, of course, was one that most beginners run into, I guess, is that it wasn't very focused at all. So that's the first lesson really that you need to learn is focus on what you want to do with your deck. Well, this was back during the spoils mulligan, so a lot of the more egregious um, deck building flaws of this deck weren't as bad back then because you could spoil bad cards away in your opening hand. But just generally playing aggressive one-drops like Diagraph Ghoul in the same deck as control finishers like Zoran Markov here, probably not the best idea. So yeah, so that's basically where the flaws of this deck came in more most. But also another very important lesson to learn with this early iteration is that every Highlander deck is, well, I won't say bad in the beginning, but at least it's not perfect. And what a lot of, especially newer players, but also the ones that have a little more experience in the format, tend to do, which I find really disheartening, is that they will start a deck with a cool idea, notice that it's not working out the way they thought, and then basically give up on it, which I think is the completely wrong way to go about deck building. You know, it needs time to develop a deck, you know, to make it better. And yeah, you will lose a shit ton of games. I lost with this for like a year before I started winning anything. Um, Constantly. I don't remember winning like more than one match a tournament or something for like the better part of a year before I had any kind of success with this deck. Um, but that's what you need to go through to get to a stage where um, where you know enough about your deck to know what you have to change. And also sometimes the cards you need just aren't printed yet. Sometimes you need to wait to really make the deck idea function the way you want to. And that's something I learned a lot with this deck. And I think the format would be a lot more diverse if more people would um, stick to their ideas and try to develop them instead of just giving up, or at least revisit them after a while, you know, because decks don't usually stay unplayable for forever. You know, at some point there will be enough cards to make a deck idea function the way you want it to. And I think that's really maybe the most important lesson to learn whenever starting to build a new deck. All right, so let's go to the second iteration. This was from the same year, but a bit later. This is the other deck list was from January. I think this is from November, so almost a year later. And this was the first deck list that made that had a little bit of success, really, at a larger tournament. It was I think in MKM tournament with like 36 or 38 players, and I managed to get ninth place, just shy of the top 8 with this list. It was also shortly after the change to from the spoil mulligan to the free mulligan, so you can see a lot of the changes in this deck already. Like the 6-drops are gone. You know, it's more. There's a lot more focus on what you want to do. And the second lesson, I think you want to learn really is to kind of streamline your deck. You know, and try to focus on the stuff it does best, and not necessarily on the stuff that it can't do. If you just try to um, uh, to compensate for the weaknesses of your deck instead of focusing on what it does best, I think you're setting yourself up for failure. And that's also something I had to learn around that time, you know, because for the better part of that year, I tried to kind of compensate for the flaws of the deck instead of really focusing on strengths. So, for example, I would play cards that had unique effects that weren't usually available in black, that did something that black wouldn't normally do, stuff like Im's Mischief, for example, which is somewhat of a kind of a misdirection, but in black, for everyone who doesn't know it. But those cards usually don't, you know, they don't um, help you focus on your actual plan. And I think this was the first time when that lesson really struck home, and I could have some success because of that. You know, this is basically the model for how the deck stayed for quite a while. And you know, it's also where I started to have a little bit of a budget. As you can see, there's some more expensive cards already in here. But yeah, like this was basically when the deck started getting enough focus to really be successful on a little bit of a larger scale than before. Yeah, and so this was basically the blueprint for the deck for the next few years. It didn't change all that much. Of course, there were additions, there were cards that went away, but all in all, like, this is the first step towards the really the modern iteration, I'd say, of the deck. So the next step, it's kind of a big step ahead, because, as I said, there's not much change in the years in between. But this is the list I had the most success with so far. This is from Continental Cup 1, where I made top 8 with this list. This was around the time the last Ravnica set came out, so you have stuff like Midnight Reaper in here, and it's basically a little bit of a more synergistic list than the last one, but it didn't change too much from that point, and basically you can notice a little bit that the format was getting faster already, but not that fast yet. I was still playing 5 drops in this list, and that was still okay, but you definitely noticed a trend towards faster gameplay. But really, the most important lesson I learned with this list is that sometimes the best thing to do is not to overthink things too much. Because before this tournament, I was kind of struggling with the list. It didn't put up as good of results as I would have hoped to, and I also didn't quite know why. So I didn't know how to improve the deck well enough to make it successful. And what I did then was to just go back to stuff that had worked in the past. For example, Lake of the Dead had left the deck for quite a long time before this tournament, and this was the first time I put it back in. And it was pretty awesome, because right at that point of time there, the format was getting faster. It didn't quite do the insane jump it did the next year with like Modern Masters and War of the Spark and all these sets that really introduced these insanely powerful low-cost cards into the format. But it was already heading towards a faster format, and so cards like Lake of the Dead, which allow like insane tempo swings. You play this on turn 4, and all of a sudden you have 7 mana and can dump your entire hand. Stuff like that. So that's I think the best lesson is to look back to the past, stuff that worked in the past, even though you excluded it out of your deck at some point. It might come the point where it gets good enough to reconsider again. It's no card is ever gone completely. There's seldom a point in Highlander, I'd say, where a card becomes completely unplayable and you can't ever consider it again. Maybe if there's a strictly better a strictly better reprint, more or less in quotation marks, then of course it's probably not good enough anymore. But even then, you know, you need to build redundancy, and to do that, you also need the slightly worse iterations of the cards you want to play sometimes. So this is really the lesson, I think, that can be learned from this iteration of the deck. And then I think, apart from like the change from the first version to like the more streamlined, successful version, we are jumping now towards the most drastic change in the history of the deck. This is a list from this year, from the Mind Game Mages tournament in January, where I also came in 9th place, just short of the top 8. And this list is kind of a drastic departure from the one beforehand, because what I tried to do for 2019 was to make this deck as efficient as possible. So this is mostly inspired by um, um, decks like Max Hofer's Grixis list, for example, which played a ridiculously low amount of lands and a very low curve. And I think for aggressive decks in general, that is the way to go. Of course, Max Hofer's deck is a blue deck, which has a lot easier time of playing a low land count. But I also tried to reduce the curve to as low a point as possible, and to reduce the land count. I did go more extreme with iterations of this deck, but this is like the best kind of compromise I think I came to, with around 33 lands and a curve that was around like 2.2 on average, which is kind of treacherous, because most of the deck you can play for 3 mana or less. There's only one card that requires you to have more than 3 mana, and there's a lot of delve spells and really low-costed cards in here that try to enable them as well as possible. And I think like the lesson I learned during this period was that in order to gain that efficiency and to really eke out the most competitive version of your deck possible, you have to do some cuts that to you might seem very harsh. So you have to cut some of your pet cards, probably. You have to get rid of stuff that you never questioned before, but that just might not work as well as you think to achieve what you're trying to set out. For example, in this was the first iteration of the deck where Phyrexian Obliterator was completely gone. And that was kind of a drastic change, because Phyrexian Obliterator was a card that was a mainstay in the deck from the very beginning. And I still don't consider it a bad card necessarily. It's for 4 mana. It's a very good creature. It's basically unblockable, and it clogs up the board like no other card, because no one ever wants to attack into it. So yeah, it's definitely a good card. A lot of people always told me like that was their most feared card when they played against me. But it's just too clunky, I think, for the current format that was developing over the course of 2019. 4-drops are very difficult to include in your deck, I think, and that's why I said, okay, cut them out completely, except, well, we'll get to that, because it's just not like the investment to play a 4-drop is way too much to have these days. You know, you want to maximize your chance of doing something impactful early in the game, and to do that you have to have a lower curve. And I think this really worked out pretty well, because what happened basically was that this deck suddenly got a whole lot more hands that were keepable. You know, it mulliganed way better than ever before, even with the new mulligan rule, which was kind of like a point of adjustment for a lot of decks, where they had to kind of struggle to get good hands with too many high drops, for example. If you don't have any high drops, it's very easy to mulligan and to still have a playable hand. Like it's and I think the better you can do that, the more the more games you will win, even with a mulligan to 5 or something like that. So yeah, make your deck as efficient as possible, and it will definitely pay off. So let's get to the current version of the deck. So this is where we are right now. It's not too different from the one before, but I will now get into more detail on the individual card choices themselves, instead of just broadly talking about the deck in general. So what this deck wants to do is basically play kind of a tempo game. The goal is to have the potential for very explosive, aggressive starts, but also kind of have the chance for to develop a mid or late game, you know, to have a longer breath than the average aggro deck, and to disrupt your opponent as good as possible with efficient removal, with LD spells, with discard, you know, all these things, while still maintaining a good amount of card advantage while doing so. And yeah, let's just go straight into it and show you how this deck is trying to achieve that. So first of all, I think I should talk about the mana base. Of course, it's not too surprising that most of the lands in this deck are swamps. Of course, it's a monocolor deck, so it's a given. We also have Silent Clearing and Nurturing Peatland, so the two canopy lands available in black, which are really a godsend. They help you reduce the times you flood out, of course. They are fueling your delve spells. They're sometimes a little bit awkward, because they damage you, and this deck damages itself quite a lot already, but it's usually not that big of a deal that you lose because of that. You know, um, it's usually a pretty benign in that sense. So apart from that, we also have some utility lands that kill other lands in Tectonic Edge and Wasteland. In other iterations of the decks, I often played different ones to Tectonic Edge. Like I had other versions where, for example, I played Ghost Quarter, which I think is a fine card still, but it has the downside of not being able to screw your opponent very well, which Tectonic Edge does. Tectonic Edge always sets back your opponent for a turn, and that's very important, especially if you play against Scape Shift. You want your LD to really kill the land and not just replace it with something else against that deck, and that's the deck where you want the most LD against, you know. So that's why I chose to play Tectonic Edge over Ghost Quarter in this iteration of the deck, because it's just a easier way to kind of disrupt these Scapeshift decks, which can be problematic for the deck sometimes. Apart from that, we also have fetch lands, which are mostly here to fuel the delve spells. So all of them that are available in black, of course, it's 5, with Prismatic Vista being an addition from last year. But these also have 2 other purposes you can get. First, there's a Bayou, which you need sometimes, especially against decks that are focused heavily on the graveyard, to enable your Deathrite Shaman. So this is the only reason we have this green mana in here, to enable Deathrite Shaman to exile creatures. Because especially against Reanimator, we just need this green mana for the Deathrite to function properly. Even though the 2 damage mode is really the one you want most of the time. This green mana, I wouldn't want to miss it during these matchups. And another quite recent addition to the deck is also this very nice land, Witch's Cottage, which is sometimes a little bit awkward in the early game when it enters the battlefield tapped, which can happen. But I think the upside of having this in your deck to just get with a fetch land late game and rebuy one of your threats is so insanely huge that that really isn't that big of a deal. You know, if you can enable that. Then, of course, we have 2 manlands, Mutavault and Mishra's Factory. You could play more. At some points, I also played Blinkmoth Nexus. I even tried out Hostile Desert recently, which was also okay. But I think you want to minimize the amount of colorless mana in your deck, and so really 4 to 5 colorless sources is really all this deck can take. And so I wouldn't want to include many more of these lands, even though they are really good and provide you with more resilience against your opponent's removal, especially mass removal, of course. if you have them in your deck. But they also make it necessary to play Urborg, because Urborg, it fixes your mana sometimes. You have triple black spells that are kind of difficult to cast if you have one of these colorless lands, and so I think it's still a necessary evil to have this Urborg in your deck um, to enable you to play your heavy black spells, even if you have one of your colorless utility lands on the board. And another side effect, which is quite nice, is also that it allows you to tap your pain lands without pinging yourself, to tap your fetch lands if you're low on life. If you're low on life and you draw a land drop and it's a fetch land which you otherwise wouldn't be able to use. But if you have an Urborg out, you can just play it like normal, and you don't need to be concerned that much about the life loss. So that's basically the role that Urborg plays in this deck. And then we have a Castle Lockway. All the castles are very good, and this one is probably the best one. You don't use the ability too often, but there can be moments, of course, where you flutter out, and then drawing extra cards just with your land drop is a very nice possibility. And of course, it doesn't really cost you that much. It's basically just a swamp in most situations. The amount of times when this comes into play tapped are like almost non-existent. Alright, and then we finally have Lake of the Dead and Chromebox, which are our main accelerants. These allow you basically to churn out your threats a little bit earlier than usual. Lake of the Dead, of course, is a little bit risky because you have to sack your lands, but that's that's not necessarily as much of a downside as you would think, because first of all, it enables you to often dump your entire hand, so that you're not you're not really left with anything in your hand anyway that you might not be able to play. It fuels your graveyard for Delve, which is also very relevant. So it produces a whole bunch of mana, and it dumps also the lands in your graveyard to delve away with your Delve spells. And the third thing you need to keep in mind is that every swamp you draw after you played Lake of the Dead is worth 5 mana. And so even if you go down to just the Lake of the Dead, if you have another swamp in your hand, you can still play 5 mana worth of spells the next turn. So it's not as big of a downside as you think it is. It's really it's really only awkward when this is one of 2 lands in your hand or something like that. You never want to keep a hand like that. That's the awkward part about Lake of the Dead, but the upside this provides is way higher than the downside of needing to sack some lands to get the mana out of it. And then, of course, Chromebox. Chromebox is a card which I included just recently again, because I noticed how very important it is to be on the play, especially against other aggressive decks, which I was playing a lot against recently. And really going down the card just to be a turn faster, it just puts you on the play, basically. You know, that's why I think this is a very good addition. That is also very underplayed in a lot of aggressive decks in the format at the moment. Especially since, you know, dropping a 2-drop on turn 1 can be what accelerates you past past the other deck and can mean the difference between winning and losing in many matchups. Alright, so that's the mana base. Additionally, you also have where is it? There it is, Dark Ritual. It's just a one-shot effect, but the starts you have with Dark Ritual are often the most insane starts you can get. You know, because this puts you 2 turns ahead of your opponent. You can just drop a 3-drop on turn 1, a 4-drop on turn 2. You know, this starts like this are often the ones that win you the game. And to that extent, I wouldn't want to miss it ever in this deck. Alright, so those are the different types of lands and mana accelerants, of course. And now let's go on to discussing the rest of the deck, really. So the creatures, or let's say the threats, which, you know, would be better. The creatures in this deck have to fulfill one of 2 very important functions. One of them is to provide card advantage, which is often the case with the lower costed creatures, and then at the more higher costed slot, another very important function is to just be very efficient and big. So you can basically outvalue your opponent. So something I wanted to really stock up on as much as I could was kind of Dark Confidant like effects, so small creatures that draw you extra cards. So we have Asylum Visitor here, which is very nice with some other cards in the deck that cause you to discard cards, like Smuggler's Copter, which also falls in this category, incidentally. Smuggler's Copter is also the only card that I want to play that requires creatures, because it's just so damn efficient in what it does, and it basically gives every creature you play haste. And yeah, if you discard an Asylum Visitor with a Smuggler's Copter, it just draws you a card initially upon entering the battlefield, which is pretty nice. And then the effect of drawing extra cards when one of the players is empty-handed is pretty relevant, because you do play out your hand pretty quickly with this deck. And also, of course, you're attacking your opponent's hand, so it does happen fairly often that this draws at least 1 to 2 cards in a game, and if your 2-drop can do that, and at the same time have 3 power, it's already a good investment, I'd say. Also in this category, we have Dark Confidant, of course, classic. Everyone knows what it does, and yes, I do play it with cards like Tombstalker and Gurmag Angler in the deck. Of course, it happens that it domes you for 7 or 8 sometimes, but those cases are very rare, and I think you shouldn't be too worried about it, really. You know, like it says on the card, greatness at any cost. So that's really what I think should be the lesson you take away from this. That um, as long as it works most of the time, the fail state is negligible, and you shouldn't be worried about that. Because most of the time this just wins you the game because it draws an extra card each turn. So not really much more to say about that. So then we have Dinsley's Siphoner, which is a lot slower as a draw engine, but has evasion, which is nice. So it can get pretty annoying for the opponent if this just can attack unimpeded, which it often can. And lastly, in this category, we have Painseer, which is probably the worst of these pseudo bobs, of these 2 drops that draw you extra cards. But at the same time, it's also, it still works. It still works, and uh, what I like best about this card is that it has very nice synergies with Smuggler's Copter. If you have a Smuggler's Copter and the Painseer on the board, it's just an insane draw engine because the Copter draws the extra cards. Of course, you have to loot them away, but if you tap the Painseer for it, you draw an extra card when it untaps as well, and that's an engine that can win quite a lot of games, obviously. Actually, I forgot the last Bob effect in Ruin Raider. This is probably the best pseudo Bob because it draws you a card just when it enters the battlefield at the end of turn, of course. And then we have Zig, River Cutthroat, which is kind of always on the edge of staying in the deck, but then again, it whenever often performs better than it should. As a 1/3 for 2 is not a very aggressive body, and that's basically my main problem with this card. But at the same time, it still draws you extra cards, and it does so honestly pretty consistently. Which, yeah, it always goes in and out, and it's I don't know. I'm always kind of on the fence about this card, but for now I think it will probably stay in the deck for the foreseeable future. All right, so those are the cards that are just outright supposed to provide raw card advantage, and then we have cards that kind of get you virtual card advantage, I'd say. Cards that don't necessarily draw you cards right away or draw you cards on a regular basis, but which can provide you still with a lot more card advantage over the long term, which kind of can trade up 2-for-1 and stuff like that. So there we have Crypt Breaker. The tap 3 zombies draw a card effect. It happens sometimes, but it's regularly you're just using this to churn out tokens, to convert every land that you top deck or like a Bloodghast or something into a 2/2 token, and then beat down with those tokens. It's usually not used as a draw engine, also, although it can do that as well. Then we have cards like, where is it? Iseret? which can get you creatures back whenever it attacks. It's a very well. It's of course a situational effect, but it can often attack very quite unimpeded because of Death Touch. And there have been games where just won outright because it got back a fatty that was countered before, or it got back it got back a necessary tool creature to um, like a vampire hexmage, for example, to basically disrupt your opponent. And to that extent, I think this has really earned its spot in the deck, and it's been a mainstay ever since. Then we have Mardu Strike Leader, which um, a lot of people kind of underestimate this card. But if this can attack unimpeded even once, um, it's already traded similarly to a kitchen fix when it gets killed. You know, it's a 3/2 that leaves a 2/1 behind. So that's a good deal by my estimation, and it's also a very flexible card because you can use the dash ability to threaten enemy planeswalkers out of nowhere. You know, maybe your opponent just wrath the board, you know, slams down a Jace, brainstorms, taps out, and doesn't expect you to have anything because you're black and you're not playing haste creatures. Well, just dash in your Mardu Strike Leader and go to town, you know, killing that Jace and leaving behind a 2/1 in the process. That's just a pretty deadly swing. Then we have Midnight Reaper and its smaller cousin Undead Augur, which draw cards when creatures die. Really good effect, especially when you're playing against other creature decks where you can just trade your creatures and always get a 2-for-1 out of it. And we have Relentless Dead, which is kind of similar in a way. It's a very resilient threat that can also get back other creatures as well, though. So this kind of straddles the line between these virtual card advantage cards, and the next category I'd say would be resilient threats. So threats that come back or are hard to kill. So there we have Bloodghast, of course, Bloodsoaked Champion. We have Dread Wanderer, Gravecrawler, Gutterbones, Hogak, if you want to count it, although it's also kind of fits into the big beta category. And this card actually, because a lot of people are kind of skeptical about this card, this is very easy to enable. I've played this on turn 2 multiple times now, so yeah. Might not fit into every deck, but in this deck it's absolutely insane. Okay, then we have other resilient threats. Pack Rat, you can count in this category because this can just win a game on its own, and it's also kind of a flood protection, which is nice. And of course, it's very hard to kill if you end up with it, because you can just make new Pack Rats. Scrap Heat Scourger, of course, and the newest edition, Woe Strider. You don't get this back as often as many of the other creatures because the escape cost is very expensive. There are some games where you don't hit 5 mana, but even then, it's still a very good card. The Sack Outlet is also relevant. The Goat token is surprisingly relevant because it can screw up your opponent's combat math if you just get a chump blocker out of nowhere. And yeah, so this card is a very good addition to the deck that I was very happy about when the new Theros set came out. Alright, so then of course we have good tool creatures like Deathrite Shaman, Vampire Hexmage, also some kind of maybe, you know, unorthodox ones like Air of Falconwrath. You know, I would count this as more of a tool creature than just a beatdown thing, because you sometimes just want to discard stuff, and it's not really a downside, so you just get a 3/2 flyer out of the deal. So I have Maya Triton and Stitcher Supplier, which shovel cards into the graveyard, and that also often amounts to well, them basically drawing you a card. If they mill over like a Gravecrawler or something like that, that's essentially like drawing you a card. And also they enable a lot of the delve spells. You know, they enable a lot of the graveyard synergies, and that's why this is why I think these are very good inclusions into this deck. Then you have Murderous Rider, which is a card I'm kind of skeptical about at the moment, because it's obviously a very good card. It's just almost always a 2-for-1, but on the other hand, it's also a very clunky card. I've cut Hero's Downfall from this deck a long time ago because it was just too clunky, and I don't think the flexibility is necessarily worth spending 3 mana on this effect. And a 2/3 lifelinker for 3 is also not the best, especially since it tucks itself underneath the deck. I know this is necessarily so that it's not broken or anything, but that also kind of takes away a lot of the appeal of this card, you know. I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about it at the moment. It's good, but it's maybe not good enough. Yeah, so yeah, that's that. We also have Gifted Etherborn and Knight of the Ebon Legion, just some efficient beaters in the 1 and 2 drop slot. Then of course some delve threats like Magangler, Hogak, and Tombstalker. Just some big beaters that potentially can come down very early. The same with Rotting Regisaur and Pitiless Horde. Pitiless Horde has the same upside as Mardu Strike Leader, in that you can dash it in, and it's sometimes just Lava Axe that takes out your opponent's Planeswalker when they least expect it. And yeah, I haven't played this for quite a long time, and just took it in recently because of the new Planeswalker Menace, and it really has proven its worth so far. And then the only 4-drop in the deck still left is Rankle, Master of Pranks, because this just wins you so many games. It's absolutely insane, because every one of these effects is very good at disrupting your opponent. I think the one I use the least actually is the one that says each player loses 1 life and draws a card. The only point where this is a good effect, I'd say, is if you know your opponent isn't drawing anything anyway, and and you can maybe make them discard in some other way, like maybe if you have a Liliana as well, you know, you can make them discard the card they just drew. And of course, if you need 4 damage and Rankle does 3, and the 1 life you make them lose is the last point of damage, of course, then it's very good. But apart from that, this is probably the least used mode of this card. You just want to beat down and strip them of their resources as much as you can. And the fact that this also threatens Planeswalker very well is a nice bonus. Why this is the only 4-drop that is still allowed in this deck at this point in time. Then also kind of getting into the threat category, we have 3 enchantments: Bitter Blossom, Dreadhorde Invasion, and Timurid Calls the Dead. This is also kind of a delve enabler, of course. It also enables graveyard synergies very well. Sometimes it's kind of awkward if you whiff, because because this of course gets a lot worse when you don't get to create the 2/2 zombie tokens. But the fact that you have other zombies in the deck as well makes the last mode a lot better than it would usually be. So it's sometimes scrying and gaining life for more than just the two zombies you get from it itself. Like I think the most I scryed with this was scry 5 and gain 5 life, and that's pretty powerful. Dreadhorde Invasion I'm not too sure about anymore. In theory, it's similar to Bitter Blossom in that it's a good threat, especially against a more controlling opponent, where they might be able to deal with a token, but they aren't as good at dealing with the Dreadhorde Invasion itself. If they wreath the board, this helps you rebuild very fast. It's also a zombie, so it has some synergies within the deck, but I often find it's too slow and too easy to circumvent, because they just block the token, and what have you, what's the deal then? I mean, of course, if they need to jump it or trade, that's good, but I don't think it's that good of an addition anymore. I'm kind of on the fence about this as well. So this will be probably cut for a card from the new Ikoria set. There's two that are really interesting for me, which is Lures of the Dream Den and the Fiend Artisan, and at least one of these will probably replace Dreadhorde Invasion as soon as it comes out. Alright. So just to round out the permanents, of course we have the two best black planeswalkers. There are in Liliana, The Last Hope, and Liliana of the Veil. Both fit the deck really well, and I think there's not much to say about this anymore. It's just obvious how good these cards are. And then we get into the spells, which are some of them are pretty obvious, some of them probably not so much, and that's what I really want to get into now. So first of all, of course, we have instants with a lot of removal, like Vendetta, Snuff Out, Sickening Shoal, Murderous Cut, Malicious Affliction, Fatal Push, Dismember, Defile. All the very efficient removals, some free spells even. Everything you can play for 1 mana except for Malicious Affliction, which is a 2-for-1 though in a lot of the cases, and so it really earns its spot anyway. Then of course you have Dark Blast, which is also a removal spell, but at the same time does some double duty as an enabler for graveyard synergies and delve spells, because it's very good at getting cards into your graveyard. And of course, if you play against an opponent that has like a lot of 1 toughness creatures, this is just insane. If you can just dredge up this every turn, kill their threat, and swing in with yours, that's a lot of the times that's not really something these decks can beat very well. Of course, if it gets too far and dredging Dark Blast is all you do, that's a bad thing, but that seldom happens. Usually it's enough to cast this like 2 to 3 times in a game, and then that's enough to win you the game. We also have a tutor and entomb. Most of the time this gets Hogak, but Dark Blast or some graveyard synergy creature like Bloodghast, and those are also like valid targets. So um, this is I think a very good addition that enables your deck to function a little more smoothly a lot of the times. And also a new addition is Cling to Dust. I was very skeptical of this card at first, and I still am. It's been okay so far, I'd say, in the games I played with it. Um, I'd even go as far as to say it won me some games, sure, especially against Mono Red, where I was able to gain 3 life at a clutch moment in time. But on the other hand, it's kind of mopey and often doesn't do very much. It just gets cycled away. So I'm not really sure about this, and I will probably cut it if something much better comes around in the future. So this is probably the first candidate of the spells I would cut um, in the future, or at least of these instances. Alright, so then in the sorcery department, we of course have the usual discard spells, Thoughtseize, Duress, Hymn to Turak, and Inquisition of Kozilek. Everyone knows those. Additionally, rounding out the discard suite is Drill Bit, which is easily to enable for 1 mana in this deck. I had some situations where you cast this for 3 mana and it's still fine, but yeah, you usually don't want to do that. So it can be awkward at times, and this is also a candidate that might be on the cutting board, but so far it's still okay. And Collective Brutality, which also does double duty as a flexible removal spell, discard spell. Sometimes if you need the 2 extra damage to kill your opponent, it's pretty nice, and it's also an enabler for a bunch of stuff, because you sometimes just need the discard outlet to really get going with what you want to do. Then we have 2 reanimation spells in Unearth and Reanimate. Of course, the most efficient cards, for 1 mana, get either a small creature or whatever back. We are shuffling a bunch of stuff into our own graveyard, and of course killing a bunch of our opponent's creatures. So that's where these shine the most. If you can snag your opponent's Primeval Titan or something off a discard spell on turn 2, that's pretty nice. To facilitate all that, of course, we have Demonic Tutor. Another very nice tutor option. Actually, I forgot to mention something in the instant department. We also play Demonic Consultation as a second tutor. It's kind of risky, but it seldom loses you the game. Most of the time, it just functions as a very nice flexible tutor. Usually it's spots where you're either about to win the game or about to lose if you don't draw the right card. Then this card shines the most. But even if you don't, if you don't necessarily want to get some action card, this can still get you just a swamp, and it's safe. It can just turn itself into a swamp, and you don't run the risk of losing anything, which is pretty cool. So, I probably wouldn't play this in most Highlander decks, but in a deck where you can always have a safe option to just fix your mana a little, it's totally fine. Then we have Spark Harvest, which is another removal spell. This was marsh casualties before, and yeah, it's kind of debatable which of these cards is better, to be honest. Spark Harvest is, of course, sometimes a little awkward because it requires you to sacrifice a creature or pay for extra mana. But it's also a very efficient answer to Planeswalkers, which you need in the current format, I think. Like I said earlier, recently I've played against a lot of weenie decks, which are playing like a bunch of small creatures, and I had this, and I was thinking, well, I wish this was Marsh Casualties right now, but yeah, both cards do an admirable job at killing your opponent's stuff. So yeah, this has actually worked out better than I thought initially. Sacrificing that one creature, especially if it's like a 1-drop or a token or something, it's really not that big of a deal to get rid of your opponent's planeswalkers. So that's why this card is in here. And then finally we have kind of the centerpiece of the deck that kind of inspired this initial iteration. And first we have kind of our land death suite, I guess. Sinkhole, pretty obvious. Then we also have Smallpox and Pox. So I think Pox is a pretty misunderstood card. Because most of the decks that play Pox, even in Highlander, are decks that try to do kind of a control game, and I guess that's possible in like Legacy Pox, but in Highlander you don't have the redundancy of a 60 card, 4 cards each format, so you can't play Pox with like 4 Mutavaults and 4 Bloodghasts and stuff like that. So you have to be more aggressive. You can't break the symmetry on that level. You have to break the symmetry of this card in kind of a different level. And the way you do that is to basically make it so you play this in circumstances where you end up basically the same as you were before. If you play this with like on the draw on turn 4, for example, and you have 3 creatures, your opponent has 2, and he has 4 lands. You have 3 cards in hand after playing Pox. He might have 4 or something like that, or 2. You always get more out of this than your opponent, especially if you can then maybe drop a land and play a Gurmag Angler or something like that afterwards, or if you have Bloodghasts or Geraph's Messengers and stuff like that. You basically don't sacrifice anything if you sacrifice a Geraph's Messenger. You just get back the creature you just sacked, and while your opponent has to greatly diminish their board and their hand at the same time. And the most backbreaking part, of course, is they also need to sacrifice lands, which again, this is probably the best card you can have against Scapeshift. If they ramp to like 5 lands or something and want to and threaten to go off next turn, you just play this. They have to sacrifice 2 lands and they're back 2 turns again, or 1 if they play the ramp spell or something like that. So this is really something that buys you a lot of time and also helps you in damaging them at the same time, because of course they also lose life. So really where this card shines the most, I think, is in an aggressive shell and not in a controlling one, because this is very much a proactive card. It's not like a Wrath. It's like a proactive piece of disruption that you want to play to make your opponent sacrifice a lot of their resources while you don't lose that much, and also you can operate on a a lower resource count than they can most of the time. So this is really when this shines. You want to force your opponent into a low resource game, which you just can play better than they can. Alright, so this is the deck. I'd say it's fairly competitive, I'd say. Although, yeah, most people tend to underestimate it a little bit, I think. But hey, that's also a good thing if they don't know what you're capable of. You're more likely to pull it off without disruption. But yeah, this deck has a fairly consistent 50-50 record. At FNMs and also at larger tournaments. So of course there are times when you go like 1-3 or something like that, but you basically well, the next week you go 3-1, and sometimes you go 3-1 3 weeks in a row, and stuff like that. So yeah, I think it has around 50% win percentage, which it's I think what you're aiming for in a competitive deck, and I think you can't really do much better in Highlander anyway with such a diverse format. So I'm very happy about that, and it matches up pretty well against even a lot of the tier 1 in quotation marks decks in the format. Like it has a pretty good mono red matchup. I'd say the matchup against most mid-range or combo decks is like about 50-50. Same goes for like a lot of the more aggressive builds like White Weenie. The win percentage there is very dependent on who goes first, I'd say. So it's very much 50-50. And it has an insanely good matchup, I'd say, against blue X tempo decks, and especially the ones that kind of rely on like non-basic hate to bolster their appeal. So like, is it or blue-white tempo, stuff like that. This deck is pretty good against those decks, because those decks usually have a pretty low creature count, which is easy for you to disrupt, and their counter spells aren't as good against you because you have creatures that come back from the graveyard. They you have a ton of removal to deal with their threats, and they don't have as many as you have, so you will always have the upper hand in getting in damage and usually win the race. And so I think this deck really matches up fairly well against these tempo lists. The worst matchup, on the other hand, is probably Control. Depends on which control deck. The worst type of control is stuff that relies not as much on wrath effects to keep you from attacking, but stuff like enchantments, control enchantments like Mode. Those decks just punish you very hard because you don't have any artifact or enchantment removal. Most of the time you just don't need that. Equipment is most of the time the extent to which artifacts and enchantments go in this format, and so those are pretty easily dealt with by just removing the creatures that are attached to the equipment. And so you often just don't really need it. But yeah, like those decks punish you hard because when you can't attack, what are you supposed to do? That's the main way how you win the game. And maybe you can claw yourself out of it with like a Liliana ultimate or something like that. But your chances are very slim if your opponent has, control effects that stay on the board and that keep you from attacking. But thankfully, those decks are also pretty rare. The only deck that is widely played, which has some of these effects, is the Academy combo deck, which is why I'd say out of the widely played tier 1 in quotation marks deck lists, the Academy deck is probably the worst matchup. Apart from that, this is a deck that is fairly competitive against the rest of the field, and has a decent chance at winning against most of them. Alright, so yeah, that was my first deck tech. I hope you had fun. I will probably throw some gameplay footage in here as well at some point. The problem right now is that I haven't really found a good way to record myself doing that yet. But yeah, so look forward to that in the future. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will be back next week, hopefully, with another deck list. So, happy Easter and see you soon.